Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, May 24th, 2022. 14 children and one teacher killed in a shooting at a Texas elementary school. We'll hear from the governor in just a moment. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg telling political and business leaders at the World Economic Forum when it comes to dealing with countries like Russia and China, freedom is more important than free trade. The protection of our values is more important than profit. Today is 3 months since Russian President Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. President Joe Biden meeting in Tokyo with the heads of the other so-called Quad nations, Japan, India, and Australia, pledging to counter China's aggressiveness and create a free and open Indo-Pacific. President Biden also again emphasizing there's been no change in U.S. policy toward Taiwan after saying in the past few days he would send U.S. forces to defend the island if Taiwan is invaded by China. We'll talk about the Quad meeting with Sheila Smith from the Council on Foreign Relations. And Attorney General Merrick Garland announcing a settlement with the commodities company Glencore over foreign bribery and market manipulation charges, company agreeing to pay at least $1.2 billion. And it's campaign primary day in 5 U.S. states, some closely watched races in Georgia and Alabama. C-SPAN will have the results as they come in tonight, posted at cspan.org. From Associated Press, 14 children and one teacher were killed in a shooting at a Texas elementary school Tuesday, the governor said, and the 18-year-old gunman was dead. Governor Greg Abbott said a local man opened fire at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, about 85 miles west of San Antonio. It was the deadliest school shooting in Texas history and occurred 4 years after a gunman fatally shot 10 people at Santa Fe High School in the Houston area. Governor Abbott was in Abilene at the time giving an update.
The shooter was Salvador Romas, an 18-year-old male who resided in Uvalde. It's believed that he abandoned his vehicle and entered into the Robb Elementary School in Uvalde with a handgun, and he may have also had a rifle, but that is not yet confirmed according to my most recent report. He shot and killed horrifically, incomprehensibly, 14 students and killed a teacher. Mr. Romas, the shooter, he himself is deceased and is believed that responding officers killed him.
Governor Greg Abbott, Republican from Texas and Abilene, about the shooting today in Uvalde. 14 children, one teacher killed in an elementary school, and the 18-year-old gunman has been killed. In Washington, on the U.S. Senate floor, this reaction from Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut.
14 kids dead in an elementary school in Texas right now. What are we doing? What are we doing? Just days after a shooter walked into a grocery store to gun down African American patrons, we have another Sandy Hook on our hands. What are we doing? There have been more mass shootings than days in the year. Our kids are living in fear every single time they set foot in a classroom because they think they're going to be next. What are we doing? Why do you spend all this time running for the United States Senate? Why do you go through all the hassle of getting this job, of putting yourself in a position of authority, if your answer is that as this slaughter increases, as our kids run for their lives, we do nothing? What are we doing? Why are you here? If not to solve a problem as existential as this. This isn't inevitable. These kids weren't unlucky. This only happens in this country and nowhere else. Nowhere else do little kids go to school thinking that they might be shot that day. Nowhere else do parents have to talk to their kids, as I have had to do, about why they got locked into a bathroom and told to be quiet for 5 minutes just in case a bad man entered that building. Nowhere else does that happen except here in the United States of America, and it is a choice. It is our choice to let it continue. What are we doing?
Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut on the Senate floor in Washington, responding to the news out of Uvalde, Texas. A shooting at an elementary school, 14 children and one teacher killed, the 18-year-old gunman also dead. Now to the war in Ukraine. This from BBC News. The war has highlighted how countries need to put values before profits, NATO's chief has warned. Jens Stoltenberg said it had shown how economic relations with authoritarian regimes can create vulnerabilities. His speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos singled out trade with Russia and China in particular. Mr. Stoltenberg pointed to issues such as Russia's dominance over Europe's gas supply, as well as bids from Chinese companies to run 5G networks. That from BBC News. Here is part of Jens Stoltenberg's speech.
NATO allies and the European Union have imposed unprecedented sanctions on Putin's war machine. Countries from Switzerland to South Korea have joined us and also applied sanctions. And hundreds of international companies have pulled out of Russia. These massive sanctions remind us of one of the important lessons from this conflict: that we should not trade long-term security needs for short-term economic interests. The war in Ukraine demonstrates how economic relations with authoritarian regimes can create vulnerabilities. Over-reliance on the import of key commodities like energy. Risks created by exporting advanced technologies like artificial intelligence, and weakened resilience caused by foreign control over critical infrastructure like 5G. This is about Russia, but also about China, another authoritarian regime that does not share our values and that undermines the rules-based international order. International trade has undoubtedly brought great prosperity. I, and many of us here today, including Børge Brende, have worked hard to promote a more globalized economy. But we must recognize that our economic choices have consequences for our security. Freedom is more important than free trade. The protection of our values is more important than profit.
The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. An update on the war in Ukraine from Reuters. They write that Russian forces were conducting an all-out assault on Tuesday to encircle Ukrainian troops in twin cities straddling a river in eastern Ukraine, a battle which could determine the success or failure of Moscow's main campaign in the east. Another Reuters article has this. European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen on Tuesday called for talks with Moscow on unlocking wheat exports that are trapped in Ukraine as a result of a Russian sea blockade. Von der Leyen, who is president of the European Union's executive, said a food crisis was approaching at full speed and some sort of dialogue with Moscow was needed to unlock 20 million tons of wheat stuck in Ukraine. She said that in an interview with Reuters. She also spoke about this issue to the World Economic Forum in Davos.
In Russian-occupied Ukraine, the Kremlin's army is confiscating grain stocks and machinery. For some, this brought back memories from a dark past, the times of the Soviets, crop seizures, and the devastating famine of the 1930s. Today, Russia's artillery is bombarding grain warehouses in Ukraine, deliberately. And Russian warships in the Black Sea are blockading Ukrainian ships full of wheat and sunflower seeds. The consequences of these shameful acts are there for everyone to see. Global wheat prices are skyrocketing, and it's the fragile countries and vulnerable populations that suffer the most. Bread prices in Lebanon have increased by 70%, and food shipments from Odessa could not reach Somalia. And on top of this, Russia is now hoarding its own food exports as a form of blackmail, holding back supplies to increase global prices or trading wheat in exchange for political support. This is using hunger and grain to wield power. And again, our answer is and must be to mobilize greater collaboration and support at the European and global level.
The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the world's reaction also on the agenda as President Joe Biden met in Tokyo with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and the newly elected Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. Those four countries, known as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad for short, they also discussed China's foreign policy, a joint statement pledging their steadfast commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific that is inclusive and resilient. This is part of President Biden's opening statement.
Quad leaders met for the first time just over 1 year ago. It seems longer, but to date our partnership is central to achieving our goals and critical for the foundation of our continuing cooperation, in my view. We already accomplished a great deal, as was referenced earlier, cooperating on COVID-19 response and health security. More to do, to state the obvious. Partnering on 5G and technology supply chains, technology standard setting, and launching our Quad Fellowship Program, which I think is going to make a difference, which we talked about earlier. At the same time, we're navigating a dark hour in our shared history. The Russian brutal and unprovoked war against Ukraine has triggered a humanitarian catastrophe, and innocent civilians have killed in the streets, and millions of refugees are internally displaced as well as exiled. And this is more than just a European issue. It's a global issue. The fact is that if you turn on the television and you'll see what Russia's doing now, it appears to me that Putin is just trying to extinguish a culture. He's not even aiming at military targets anymore. He's taking out every school, every church, every natural history museum, as if to try to obliterate the Ukrainian culture. And the world has to deal with it, and we are. The global food crisis is made worse by Russia's blocking Ukraine from exporting its millions of tons of grain. And also, as long as Russia continues the war, the United States will work with our partners to help lead a global response, because it's going to affect all parts of the world. At the same time, the United States must and will be a strong, steady, and enduring partner in the Indo-Pacific. We are an Indo-Pacific. We are an Indo-Pacific power. As once asked by, well, I won't go into it, but I was once asked by the leader of China why I kept talking about being an Indo-Pacific power. I said, because we are. We share the Pacific, one entire side of our country, and we have been deeply involved with all of you for a long time. As long as Russia continues this war, we're going to continue to be partners and lead a global response. And you know, we're Indo-Pacific power, as I said. We're going to stand with you, our close democratic partners, and we're going to stand for the shared values that and the shared vision we all have. You know, shortly before Russia launched its invasion, my administration published our Indo-Pacific strategy to advance a free, open, connected, secure, and resilient Indo-Pacific. Russia's assault on Ukraine only heightens the importance of those goals. The fundamental principles of international order, territorial integrity and sovereignty, international law, human rights, must always be defended, regardless of where they're violated in the world. So the Quad has a lot of work ahead of us. It's the fact of the matter is that we have a lot of work to do, keeping this region peaceful and stable, tackling this pandemic and the next one, and addressing the climate crisis as referenced by our new colleague, ensuring that technologies of the future are governed according to our values, But in a short time, we've shown the Quad isn't just a passing fad. We mean business. We're here to get things done for the region, and I'm proud of what we're building together, and I look forward to our vital partnership flourishing and for many years to come. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister.
More on President Biden's meeting in Tokyo with the leaders of the Quad countries, Australia, Japan, and India. We're joined by Sheila Smith, Senior Fellow in Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
President Biden again walking back some of his comments about defending Taiwan from a possible Chinese invasion. This is what he said during the Quad group photo.
Mr. President, is the policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan dead?
No.
Could you explain?
No.
Mr. President, would you send troops to Taiwan if China invaded?
Our policy has not changed at all. I stated that when I made my statement yesterday.
Sheila Smith, what do you make of all this?
Well, I thought it was interesting when they said, "Can you explain?" And he said, "No." So I think there's two things happening here. I think we are listening to the president say what he himself thinks. And then you're hearing sort of the people who have mastered the language of our policy on this issue come in to remind us of what the complicated language of strategic ambiguity is. President Biden, has said many things. He's spoken on Taiwan in this vein several times. So I think he's also said things about President Putin, right? He should no longer be in power. That, again, the actual policy team that supports him comes back to fix. I think, to be quite honest with you, he was out in the region. We have allies in the region who are very worried about Chinese behavior and the pressure that's being put on Taiwan, especially in Tokyo. I'm sure in his private conversations with Prime Minister Kishida, he had a very frank conversation about what would we do together should Beijing choose to use force across the Taiwan Strait. So I think he's saying what he thinks. I don't think, I don't know what's in the president's mind, but to a certain extent, I think this is a president who is quite frank about what he himself thinks, despite the complex architecture of our agreements with the Chinese. And I think it was probably quite reassuring to those who are in Tokyo, in the region, and others, of course, obviously in Taipei, that the president was pretty clear about American engagement in any kind of scenario that involved the use of force against Taiwan.
Leaders of the Quad countries meeting for the second time in a year, talking about confronting China. What has come of these meetings?
Well, the Quad has been an idea and a concept and an actual set of conversations among the United States, Japan, Australia, and India for some years now. But when President Biden came into office last year, it was elevated to a leaders' summit, which, as you know, really galvanizes the focus on any policy issue when the leaders of the countries get involved. So I think what they're trying to do is say these are four countries with shared interests. They're all four democracies, obviously. They all have deep economic relations in the region. They're worried a little bit about maritime stability out there in the Indo-Pacific. But they're also worried about new kinds of challenges in technology, innovation, and supply chain resilience, and a whole host of issues together. I think what they've done is say, we leaders now want to come together to find how we can bring certain capabilities to problem solving in the region. And these capabilities are not necessarily directed against China, but they are moving in a direction to stabilize an order in the Indo-Pacific that is looking increasingly wobbly because of the way the Chinese have been behaving. I think you've got strong support in these countries among the public for, a steady rules-based order, open trade, free trade, maritime stability, addressing questions of new technologies, but also things like digital trade rules and standards. So I do think you've got 4 countries and 4 leaders who really want to address some of the problems that are confronting the region, and also, come together to express their desire for an open and inclusive region, not a region that is going to be dominated by one power or that is going to be divided by a contest between the United States and China. So I think it's an important new place where the countries of these 4 countries can think about what is it the region needs, how can we come together, and how can we make sure that the region remains open and prosperous.
We're talking with Sheila Smith from the Council on Foreign Relations. President Biden, in his statement mentioning Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the response from the U.S., from Europe, and from countries like Japan. But in the final joint statement from the Quad, there's no mention of Russia, and some pointing to India's relationship with Russia. What's going on there?
Well, I think it's true that India has a long tradition of non-alignment. It doesn't like to take sides. It didn't like to take sides during the Cold War, as you may know. Russia and India also have a pretty important military relationship. India gets a fairly large amount of its military equipment from Russia. India, Prime Minister Modi has been very careful to say that his stance, his country's interests are to remain neutral, not to condemn other powers. But on the other hand, you've also seen Prime Minister Modi take opportunities to improve India's relations with the Europeans, individual European countries, with us, and now in the Quad with the countries of the Indo-Pacific. So I think what you're seeing is an India that is diversifying its foreign policy, not becoming, captive to any one relationship, but also aligning itself on larger norms and questions about the international order. India has no qualms about saying that aggression against a sovereign state is in violation of the post-war order. You see India also having a very close relationship with President Zelensky. So I think there's an attempt by Delhi to maintain India's sort of foreign policy autonomy and yet diversify its relationships around the globe. I think the Quad is not a place where you're going to see these 4 countries align on every issue. You may sometimes see 3, sometimes 2 members of the Quad have a particular strategic statement, but I don't think we should expect that all 4 members, India, United States, Japan, and Australia, are always going to agree on everything. And here, I think, on the Russian invasion, you see India being somewhat more reticent than the other 3 to condemn the Russians.
Sheila Smith is a senior fellow in Japan Studies at CFR, Council on Foreign Relations. Follow her work at CFR.org and on Twitter at Sheila Smith CFR. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
In Washington, D.C., the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, asked about President Biden's statements over the past couple of days about defending Taiwan or helping Taiwan defend itself against a possible invasion from China.
Taiwan. Is the U.S. policy change toward Taiwan based on the President's comment that we will defend it militarily if attacked by China? And secondly, the fact that Taiwan was not included in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, Jake Sullivan has talked about forming some kind of stronger trade relationship with Taiwan. Is that enough consolation for not including it in the framework?
Number one, the single most important thing we could do to send a message to the Chinese is to continue to help the Ukrainians defeat Putin. That's the view of the Prime Minister of Japan, the view of the defense minister of Japan that the single most important thing we could do to push back against President Xi is to help the Ukrainians beat Putin in the war that's going on right now. I gather after walking back the president's comments, the administration has basically said that the policy under previous administrations remains the same. My suggestion is to this administration, sell to the Taiwanese the weapons they would need that are appropriate for any potential Chinese invasion. And that is the single strongest thing we could do to help the Taiwanese, just like we're helping the Ukrainians, defend themselves if, in fact, they're attacked. That, in my view, is a serious deterrent. Number one, send a message to Xi by beating Putin in Ukraine. Number two, by selling to the Taiwanese the weapons they need to defend themselves if, in fact, they're attacked.
The Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell with reporters in the U.S. Capitol. The human rights organization Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation leaking thousands of documents and pictures of internment camps in the Chinese province of Xinjiang, where it's believed at least 1 million ethnic minority Uyghurs are being detained in prison-like conditions. This comes as the United Nations Human Rights Commissioner is visiting that region. Some reaction from the State Department spokesman Ned Price.
The BBC has a report out today on Xinjiang, which is based on data from police computers in the region, and they lays out in meticulous detail the way police have been targeting any expression of Uyghur identity or culture, and also evidence that the chain of command runs all the way up to Xi Jinping. So I wanted to ask, first of all, does the State Department have any reaction to the information in the report?
So I did happen to see that report. We are appalled by the reports and the jarring images of the PRC's internment camps in Xinjiang from 2018, those reports that are in those images that are being shared online. Unfortunately, the PRC's genocide and crimes against humanity against predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and Muslims of other ethnic and religious minority groups remains ongoing in Xinjiang. And this new reporting further adds to an already damning body of evidence of the PRC's atrocities in Xinjiang, including evidence previously disclosed in earlier publicly reporting, seen in satellite imagery and gathered via witness testimony from survivors and escapees of the internment and forced labor camps. Despite increasing public awareness and strong calls for accountability, the PRC government continues to deny any wrongdoing. We are deeply concerned by the PRC's failure to acknowledge and to stop these atrocities and to transparently address the chorus of concerns raised by the international community. And we'll continue to work with our partners and our allies to promote accountability for those responsible for these atrocities. We have and we continue to call on the PRC to immediately release all those arbitrarily detained people, to abolish the internment camps, to end mass detention, torture, forced sterilization, and the use of forced labor.
State Department spokesman Ned Price briefing in the State Department briefing room. Washington Today continues in a moment.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Every day, we take your calls live on the air on the news of the day, and we discuss policy issues that impact you. And coming up Wednesday morning, we'll talk about the FDA's role in the ongoing baby formula shortages in the U.S. with Scott Lincecum of the Cato Institute. Also, the U.S.'s support for Ukraine against Russian aggression. Joining us for that is the Marathon Initiative's Elbridge Colby and Mark Kansian of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Watch Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Wednesday morning on C-SPAN or on C-SPAN Now, our free mobile app. Join the discussion with your phone calls, Facebook comments, texts, and tweets.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. A few more headlines. Justice Department announcing an Iraqi citizen living in Columbus, Ohio, has been charged federally with an immigration crime and with aiding and abetting a plot to murder former President George W. Bush. He was arrested by FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force agents this morning and appeared in a federal court. According to the warrant, the suspect said he wanted to assassinate the former president because he felt that George W. Bush was responsible for killing many Iraqis and breaking apart his country after the 2003 U.S. military invasion. Congressional Naming Commission, which was set up to remove Confederate names from military bases, unveiling proposals to rename 9 of those bases. Proposed names include women, African Americans, and Latino service members. The 9 names were whittled down from more than 34,000 suggestions submitted by the public. And former White House press secretary under President Biden, Jen Psaki, officially announcing that she has a new job. It's at Msnbc, the cable TV channel. She'll be hosting a program that will debut early next year and also commenting about election coverage, both on MSNBC and NBC over the next few years. Well, today is campaign primary election day in 3 states, Georgia, Alabama, Arkansas, a special election primary day in Minnesota, and a primary runoff day in Texas. As the polls close throughout this evening, results are tabulated. C-SPAN will post those results of the races at our website at cspan.org. Senator Roy Blunt, Republican from Missouri and ranking member on the Rules and Administration Committee, which handles election issues, saying today that early voting in Georgia and the numbers that have come in showing that Democrats' insistence on a federal voting rights bill to overturn Georgia's election law and other states was misguided.
The Georgia law expanded the number of mandatory early voting days. It codified drop boxes in every county, something that didn't exist at all before the pandemic. It aligned mail-in deadlines with the postal recommendations to be sure the ballots actually got counted that were mailed in. It maintained no excuse absentee voting, which neither Delaware or New York has. 2 big critics of the law were the president and the majority leader. Neither of their states have no excuse absentee voting. By Friday of last week, that was the last day of early voting, 800,000 Georgians cast early ballots. 4 years ago, 300,000 Georgians cast early ballots. And in the presidential, 326,000 Georgians voted in the presidential. Substantially more than 2 times as many people voted under the so-called suppression law as had ever voted early in Georgia before. Hopefully, now remember, this is a law that not only took the Senate to the brink over voter suppression, it was the law that moved the All-Star game out of Atlanta because of legislative suppression that has turned out producing more early voting by far than any other time in the state's history. The goal was to make it easier to vote, which they obviously have done, and harder to cheat, which they hopefully did.
Senator Roy Blunt, Republican from Missouri, at a news conference today. A CNN article on the early voting in Georgia reads, SB 202 added new voter identification requirements for absentee ballots, empowered state officials to take over local election boards, limited the use of ballot drop boxes, and made it a crime to approach voters in line to give them food or water. Activists say it's their work that has brought about the so-called success. Several voting rights organizations across the state, like Black Voter Matters and LWV, have educated voters on the new rules. The work has included setting up hotlines to start grassroots educational networks to holding voter turnout events on weekends. In the middle of this campaign primary season, C-SPAN asked Kyle Kondik, managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia's Center for Politics, to look ahead to the rest of the contest and the midterm general election.
Midterms usually break against the president's party. Joe Biden's popularity is fairly weak, and it's been so ever since late summer of 2021. And there are going to be developments that happen every day that you think, oh, well, is this going to change the political calculus? I guess the potential Roe v. Wade decision coming up, that could be one of those things. However, it's possible that effectively the cake is kind of baked here, and that the Republicans are just ahead, and they're going to stay ahead until the election, and then it's just a question of how well do they do. And again, that's often how it goes in midterms, not always, but often. So don't necessarily assume that big blockbuster developments are going to move the needle politically, because we're in an era where the president's approval doesn't move all that much. the midterm effect has been pretty strong, at least the last 4 midterms. So, just keep that in mind.
When do we know when the cake is baked or not?
So typically, the way that some kind of forecasting models work, one of the metrics they sometimes take is second quarter GDP, which we won't know until the summer. But that's like an economic metric. But that does suggest that it's not third quarter GDP. It's like not right before the election. It's more like in the summertime, because whatever people's perceptions are of the state of the country, they may not be fully updated by the time that the election happens. So even if things get better for the for the economy and gas prices and what have you and inflation, what people are thinking about it now might inform their choices, later on, as opposed to what's going on in the fall. So, again, it's hard to know, but to be, the trajectory of these things is that, if it's looking bad for one party in a midterm environment, that kind of, generally doesn't change all that much by the time we get to the election.
Kyle Kondik from the University of Virginia Center for Politics, the managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball, named for the center's founder and director, Larry Sabato, joining C-SPAN on this morning's Washington Journal. While many political analysts are saying the Republicans appear to be in good shape to win a majority of the seats in the U.S. House after the general election, the current House Speaker, Democrat Nancy Pelosi of California, telling MSNBC this morning she believes her party will maintain its majority control.
History said the president loses seats in the off year. Well, the president gained seats in the on year. This president did not, but he won the election. He helped us hold the House. We helped him win the election. And those of our candidates or our members who won with Trump on the ballot and won in the Trump districts are in pretty strong shape. But we want more. We want more. We have to offset some changes, but we want more. I feel I have absolutely no intention of us losing this election. We'll win it one election at a time. We own the ground with our mobilization. We'll have a non-menacing message that is progressive and bold, but non-menacing, and we'll have the money to do so. They'll have endless money. We'll have enough, and we will win. And it's absolutely essential for our country. Our democracy is on the ballot. Our freedom is on the ballot.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi on MSNBC Tuesday morning. Wall Street today, the Dow up 48, NASDAQ down 270, S&P down 32. U.S. House of Representatives out of session this week and next week, but the Senate is in session for business this week. The Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, asked about the status of a couple of agenda items. First, that emergency aid for COVID-19 programs and preparedness for future pandemics.
Back to COVID relief. I know you're waiting on the House. They're not back until June 7th. So I wonder, does that mean nothing's coming before then? And also, what makes you hopeful
As I said,
that Republicans are willing to
well,
go
let's
with
hope this is so important that our Republican friends should not put anything in the way of it. We now have a decision on Title 42. I don't agree with that decision, but it's there. They should now go forward and say, let us move forward on COVID without amendments that would attempt to block it.
They're not saying that. They're not
saying that. Yes, go ahead.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer with reporters also asked about that bill that passed the House to increase funding for the Food and Drug Administration to better address the national infant formula shortage.
Senators left last week without taking up that $28 million baby formula FDA supplemental. Where do negotiations stand on that now? Can you commit to
our Republicans may not be letting us go forward, but if they don't, we're going to try to get unanimous consent. We have to show some accountability here. And when Republicans block something as simple as that, and really, in terms of its cost, not very onerous, they should be held accountable for it. We believe this should pass, and it should pass by UC.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer taking reporters' questions on Capitol Hill. From the Wall Street Journal, Glencore PLC said Tuesday it would pay at least $1.2 billion and 2 business units would plead guilty to bribery in the United Kingdom and to conspiracy to violate U.S. anti-corruption laws, resolving criminal probes into its global mining and trading business that have hung over the company for years. U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland holding a news conference at the Justice Department in Washington.
Today, the Justice Department is announcing charges in 2 separate districts and in 2 separate criminal cases involving Glencore, one of the world's largest mining and commodity trading companies. The company has agreed to plead guilty in each case. In connection with the first plea, Glencore has agreed to pay approximately $700 million in penalties for its decade-long scheme to bribe foreign officials in 7 different countries. The second plea involves Glencore's U.S. commodities trading arm, Glencore Limited, which engaged in a scheme to manipulate fuel oil prices at 2 of the busiest commercial shipping ports in the United States over the course of 8 years. Glencore has agreed to pay approximately $485 million in penalties. This represents the Justice Department's largest criminal enforcement action to date for a commodity price manipulation conspiracy in oil markets. Glencore made hundreds of millions of dollars in profits from these crimes, including $272 million from the foreign bribery scheme and $144 million from the commodity price manipulation scheme. And these crimes exacted great costs across the globe, perpetuating transnational corruption and manipulating oil prices in 2 of the largest fuel markets in America. As a result, Glencore has agreed to pay a total of approximately $1.1 billion in criminal fines and forfeiture, including forfeiture of all of Glencore's estimated profits. The company has also agreed to retain independent compliance monitors, both in the United States and overseas. In addition to these corporate enforcement actions, the Justice Department has secured guilty pleas from 2 individuals, former Glencore traders, for their involvement in this conduct.
Attorney General Merrick Garland at the Justice Department today. As Russia's war against Ukraine begins month number 4 and relations between Russia and the U.S. grow more strained, a look back now 20 years ago, May 24th, 2002, then President George W. Bush traveling to Moscow and in the Kremlin meeting President Vladimir Putin, who was in power only a couple of years, to sign a treaty to reduce the number of nuclear weapons each side has.
President Putin and I today ended a long chapter of confrontation and opened up an entirely new relationship between our countries. Mr. President, I appreciate your leadership. I appreciate your vision. I appreciate the fact that we've now laid the foundation for not only our governments, but future governments to work in a spirit of cooperation and a spirit of trust. That's good. It's good for the people of Russia. It's good for the people of the United States. President Putin and I have signed a treaty that will substantially reduce our strategic nuclear warhead arsenals to the range of 1,700 to 2,200, the lowest level in decades. This treaty liquidates the Cold War legacy of nuclear hostility between our countries. We've also signed a joint declaration of new strategic relationship that charts a course toward greater security, political and economic cooperation between Russia and the United States.
Former President George W. Bush in Moscow on this date in 2002, standing beside President Vladimir Putin. Putin also expressing optimism for the future relationship between the countries.
It's quite evident for us. Today we together counteract to global threats and challenges, and we are going to form a stable world order that is within the interests of our peoples and our countries, and I think it's in the interest of all the civilized human society.
Russian President Vladimir Putin through an interpreter in Moscow, standing beside former President George W. Bush on this day in history from C-SPAN's video library at cspan.org, 2002. And thanks for listening to Washington Today. Get more of Washington's top stories sent to you each day by subscribing to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word. You can sign up at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.
Live Wednesday on C-SPAN Radio at 11 a.m. Eastern, the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee will hear from the FDA Commissioner, Dr. Robert Califf, about the infant formula shortage in the U.S. and what's being done to alleviate it. We'll also hear from the leaders of the big companies that make the formula for the American market, Abbott, Gerber, and Reckitt. That's live Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern. Tell your smart speaker, play C-SPAN Radio.